I've got my guest on hold, and I'm very honored to be joined by John Stossel on my show, because I've been a fan of John Stossel's for a long time, probably more years than John would like to admit. And, he's now over on Fox News, which is a great venue for John. He's written books. His most recent book, Lies and Downright Stupidity, Get Out the Shovel, Why Everything You Know Is Wrong. Good title. That came out in 2007. And, my first question, John, I'd like to ask you, because you really managed to stand out in the media, and you made a name for yourself mainly on ABC. And this is a very, liberal, this is not a bastion of free market libertarian thought, yet you managed to thrive in that environment. How did you pull that off?
I pulled it off because the market works. I had demonstrated that I could do TV programs that got a good audience. And so when I started doing things that most of them found abhorrent, and it was pretty awful often that almost everybody in the hall despised what I argued, then they would have killed it, except that, we want to keep him, and he's getting some numbers, so, yeah, he'll do those crazy libertarian things, but in between them, he'll do his stories on weight loss and consumer products, and that'll be worth it.
Yeah. Well, you really were, for a long time, a lone voice out there, and now, I guess thanks to you got other media out there like Fox News and talk radio. I mean, there are other people out there that are carrying that banner, and I think a lot of what you're saying is now, been adopted by the Tea Parties and some of the congressmen that we now have. Unfortunately, I don't think it's enough to make a difference, but some of those ideals that you have been espousing for years are now finding more of a home in the media and in Washington.
Well, thank goodness. And there are more homes, finally. I love it that Judge Napolitano, has a show on my channel, the Fox Business Network, which I think you are on from time to time, and he's doing it every night, and I just love that.
I've been doing that show since it first started when they were doing it on the Internet, and I would do the show quite often, sometimes a couple times a week, just to get it started when it was just, on a strategy session online. And then it finally got to Fox, and it was on once a week rather. And now it's on every day at 8 o'clock. And I try to do the show about once a week. But yeah, it's a great show. It's got great guests, and I think it's doing well. And it's going to do better. I think his numbers are going to grow because there is a market, right? There is a market for these types of ideas, and as the government continues to destroy the economy, they're making that market bigger. And people are starting to figure it out because the mess that the government is making is now so large that it's a lot easier for people to figure it out.
I sure hope so. And it's so strange in that Napolitano and I went to college together. I didn't know him at the time. He was a year behind me. But we would go to this liberal college, Princeton, and it turns out these two guys who have the only libertarian shows on television.
Well, that's where Paul Krugman went, right? He's from Princeton.
That's true, too. And so I should say that there was the show on Showtime from Penn and Teller, but that's off the air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, anyway, so anything in particular that you wanted to, talk to my audience about? Anything going on in your world, or any interesting shows coming up that you want to talk about?
Well, we're working on shows on freeloaders, on people who, for example, hold on to their mortgage forever just because they can tweak the system so they can. People who get absurd handouts from government. I just look for things that we can take pictures of. Ideally.
Yeah, I mean, the government never looks at the unintended consequences of their policies. And obviously, an unintended consequence of the mortgage programs is that we keep people in their houses that really shouldn't be there. They would be better off leaving and renting a house that they can afford. Instead, we give them the incentive to stay in a house that they can't afford. And what actually happens is if you're living in a house and you've got a mortgage, let's say, of $400,000 on a $200,000 house, you are not going to spend one nickel maintaining that property. But if you can stay there for a couple of years rent-free, you'll stay there, and you'll trash the place. And when you finally do leave, you'll take everything but the kitchen sink with you. And now when the bank finally gets the property, they might even have to tear it down. Whereas if you would allow the foreclosure, somebody who actually has resources could come in and buy that property, have the means to take care of it, and maybe rent it out to somebody, maybe the very family who the government is keeping in the house with these mortgage bailout programs.
I'm doing a story on one woman who's been in the house not paying her rent for 20 years.
You mean her rent or her mortgage?
Mortgage.
20 years?
Not paying for 20 years. And because she represents herself, she's a former paralegal, and because the ownership of the mortgage changes hands and the paperwork is a mess, she's been able to manipulate the system to stay in there for 20 years. She's 20 years. I'm never getting out, she said.
Is she paying property tax?
I don't know. Good question.
Because I know a lot of people that aren't paying their mortgages, they're not going to pay their property tax either. And what happens is the property taxes are senior to the mortgage debt. So when these banks don't foreclose and they let the property sit there, and then the occupant is staying there, not paying their mortgage and not paying their property tax, then when the bank finally gets the possession of the property, the loss is bigger because it's got to pay all the back property taxes and, of course, all the maintenance issues that have been deferred.
And all of us have to pay more for mortgages to cover all this stuff. We just add layers of lawyers to our lives.
Well, the problem is we don't have to pay more for mortgages. I mentioned this earlier in the show that the yield now, mortgage interest rates for a 30-year mortgage is almost identical to a 30-year Treasury. So the federal government has taken all of the risk out of mortgage lending. It has told people, go ahead, lend money to anybody as long as they're going to use it to buy a house. It doesn't matter if they can pay the money back because that's the same thing as buying U.S. Treasuries. What kind of distortions are we doing to the economy by taking all the risk out of mortgage lending when it's a very risky thing?
I hadn't thought of it that way. Don't the banks lay on so many fees at closing that they make up for some of this cheating?
I doubt it.
On the interest rate?
Well, these are the conforming loans. They pass them to Freddie and Fannie. Yeah, there are some fees, but, it's a very competitive market out there, so people could shop around and get a good fee on getting a mortgage. So, and the real risk used to be figuring out who was going to pay you back and adequately pricing the mortgage for the risk. But the government has taken all that out of it because it doesn't matter. All mortgages are the same because the government guarantees them all. The only time there's really risk involved is when you get the jumbo mortgages, and that's a totally different market. But anyway, we got a commercial, so that means we're running out of time for this segment, but we're coming back. We got more with John Stossel coming up. You're listening to Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America, we're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
Welcome back. This is Peter Schiff and my guest, John Stossel of Fox News. And John, I had a good idea for a show for you to do because I think it's very appropriate. Maybe you've already done it. I don't think so. But why don't you do something on the moral hazard of unemployment compensation? Because we have a lot of people who are unemployed now, and we're giving people unemployment benefits for 2 years, and the connection between the ability to collect unemployment and the high amount of people who are not working and the moral hazard. Because I was unemployed myself one time and collected unemployment benefits, and I made sure not to even look for work until I completely exhausted my benefits. I had a great time. I was in my early 20s. I had a very inexpensive one-bedroom apartment. I owned a car. I had very low overhead. So I used my unemployment benefits to pay for parking at the beach during the day and drinks at night when I went out to clubs. And, when I exhausted my benefits, I went and got a job. I mean, I think that'd be a great show to interview a bunch of people who are collecting unemployment and who have no desire or intention to work.
I did that. That's a problem sometimes. But we keep making the same point. They're so simple, the moral hazard. And I would, what I did is just added a couple things to the points you already made. We interviewed people who said, I've had some offers, but I'm not going to take them. I'm hoping for something better. And then when the unemployment runs out, then they get a job. And something like a third of the people get a job within a few weeks of when their unemployment compensation runs out. We also interviewed the employment agencies who said, half the people we see are just going through the motions because they have to pretend to be looking for work to get their hand out.
Yeah, that's what I did. But now they make it easier because you don't even have to. You can do it online. You don't even have to lie to somebody's face. You just pretend you're working on a computer. And
I didn't know that. Well, that was not true maybe that's a state-by-state thing. It was not true in South Carolina where we did this story.
Yeah, and the liberals always want to jump on me if I try to imply that there are people who are deliberately not working, that they're going to take these checks. And I don't understand, why is that concept so hard for people to grasp, that getting paid not to work is better than having to work to get paid, especially when you factor in the taxes that you have to pay when you work, and the loss of those unemployment benefits, all the costs of working, commuting, eating in restaurants, taking your clothes to a dry cleaner. I mean, why can't the liberal figure out that it's better to have leisure and just get a check?
It just violates their sense of fairness, the needy, how these rich people on radio and TV are picking on these poor, needy people. But, heck, my job at ABC was so cushy, I sometimes had time to take off during the day, and I liked to play beach volleyball. I'd go in Central Park and play, and everybody I played with during the day was collecting unemployment and not looking for work because it was summertime, and they wanted to play ball.
Yeah, and I've run into people, businessmen, who tell me that they're looking for workers, and the only people who will accept the jobs are people who want to work under the table because they don't want to give up their unemployment benefits.
That's a result, the moral hazard you get when you got high taxes and lots of rules and people working under the table. Yeah. I enjoyed the moment in your Connecticut senatorial debate where this woman who lost and who I sued because she and her husband had an employee who maybe they told to beat me up. So it's hard for me to root for her, but I love the moment where she said to Blumenthal, "You don't create jobs." And he just looked so startled.
Well, yeah, because he does create jobs for lawyers. He doesn't understand about all the jobs he destroys for everybody else. And the problem is the jobs that get destroyed are productive jobs that we need. The jobs that get created are the ones that we don't need, that screw everything up.
And he's being interviewed in a remarkably sympathetic Wall Street Journal story this week about how he's going to protect Connecticut from budget cuts.
Oh, Blumenthal?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but what the problem for me here in Connecticut is he's going to raise taxes, and they already raised the marginal rate of tax in Connecticut last year from 5 to 6.5%, and now they're going to raise it again, as if raising taxes on the people that provide jobs and create the growth is going to solve the problems, when the problem has nothing to do with the revenue. It has to do with the money they're spending on unnecessary and unneeded government workers and government services.
I think part of the problem is law school. So many of these lawyers are trained that you can manage life with paper and procedure, and they just have no respect for markets.
But they don't understand them. I was playing sound earlier today. I don't know if you saw Joe Biden's speech about this new huge, high-speed railway network that the government wants to build with our money, and they want to build it completely with American-made trains, even though we don't make any trains. So we want to recreate the industry from the ground up. So we don't want to buy, cost efficient trains. We want to make this the biggest, most expensive, bloated rail system that nobody could ever afford to use without a government subsidy.
My favorite light rail picture is the one from Portland, Oregon. Their much heralded light rail system. They have trolleys, and there's a coyote sitting on a seat that. It's so empty all the time. You could have given everybody taxi rides, but somebody took a picture of a coyote happily sitting on an empty car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your book, which myths, lies, and downright stupidity. So what do you think in that book? What is the stupidest thing of all the things that you see that government does? What do you think is the stupidest?
I can't pick one. That's why I had to write a whole book.
Well, any example? That doesn't have to be the stupidest, just one of the stupidest.
Federal flood insurance. That you have people who, in the Mississippi floods, that they get wiped out, and it's like the liberals' attitude about unemployment compensation. Our heart goes out to them. We want to help. We have to encourage them to get insurance. Some of them are too stupid or too helpless to buy their own insurance, and it's just because there's not enough of a market. Well, there's not enough of a market because if you live on the edge of the Mississippi or on the edge of an ocean, you're at high risk. And the insurance would cost you a lot.
Yeah,
oh,
and
no,
so,
we can price it better by including everybody. So,
yeah,
they
so what the government ends up doing, you see, the free market would prevent people from building houses in areas that are prone to floods. But the government is now encouraging.
Don't use the word prevent. The free market doesn't prevent, doesn't use force. It discourages.
Yes, that's what I meant. I mean, and if we had a free market, the only people who would build homes in flood areas are people who had the money to rebuild them in case they were flooded. But what the government does...
And we're willing to take that risk.
Yes, but what the government does is it, by subsidizing the insurance so that it's lower than it would be, now a lot of people go and build in those areas that wouldn't have built, and so now when we have a flood, there's a lot more damage. So the government is exposing the whole country to all these risks. That's the unintended consequences of this subsidy. It gets people to do things that the market would have discouraged them from doing.
And it's welfare for the rich, because it gets rich people like me to do it. I built a house
Oh, there are a lot of people in Malibu.
In the Hamptons, and I collected twice. The ocean came in, took my first floor. You paid for it. Thanks. I never invited you there, but thanks for paying for it. And it happened again. You paid again. Finally took the whole house, and again you paid for the house.
Yeah,
moral hazard.
If you're going to have a house on the beach, you shouldn't be taxing people who can't afford one and are living inland so that you could rebuild your beach house. Anyway, look, John, I really appreciated you coming on my show. I look forward to watching your next show on Fox Business.